What if everything you knew about time was wrong? In 1900, the world moved at the speed of a horse. Men wore wool coats. Women carried parasols. The automobile itself was barely 5 years old, a rattling, smoke-belching novelty that terrified livestock and broke down every 3 miles. Nobody had heard of aerodynamics. Nobody had dreamed of artificial intelligence. Nobody had imagined a vehicle that could think. And yet, deep in the Montana wilderness, in the dead of a January that would become the coldest on record, a railroad surveying crew stumbled upon something buried in the frozen earth. Something that had no business being there. Something with no seams, no bolts, no engine block, no exhaust pipe, no steering wheel. Something with surfaces smoother than glass, curves that defied every law of manufacturing that existed in 1900 or 1950 or even today. The crew foreman wrote one sentence in his field journal that night and then crossed it out, then wrote it again, then tore the page entirely. His assistant, a 23-year-old surveyor named Thomas Aldrich Webb, did not tear his page. He kept it. He hid it inside the lining of his coat. He carried it for 51 years without ever showing another soul. When Thomas Webb died in 1951, his granddaughter found the page sewn into the coat's lining. She read it once. She never read it again. Because what Thomas Webb had written, in shaking, frostbitten handwriting on that January night in 1900, described something that should not exist for another 150 years. What did he see? What did they find buried in that Montana earth? And why does the U.S. government still, to this very day, classify the excavation records under a seal that does not expire until the year 2075? The answer is more terrifying than the question. The American West in January of 1900 was not a romantic place. Forget the paintings, the sweeping golden landscapes, the noble silhouettes against a painted sky. January in Montana was something else entirely. It was gray and bone-white and merciless. The kind of cold that didn't just bite, it held on, pressed itself against your chest and squeezed. The kind of silence that felt less like peace and more like the world holding its breath before delivering terrible news. The Northern Pacific Railroad Company had dispatched Survey Team 14 into the Bitterroot Range foothills on January the 9th, 1900, with a simple and unglamorous mandate. Map the subterranean elevation of a proposed secondary rail corridor running northwest from Missoula toward the Idaho border. It was paperwork work, grid work. The kind of job given to reliable men who weren't complaining, men who wouldn't make a fuss, men who understood that the railroad's appetite for expansion did not pause for weather, sentiment, or common sense. The team consisted of 7 men. Their foreman was a veteran surveyor named Gerald Amos Croft, 54 years old, a former Union Pacific man who had driven stakes across Kansas, Nebraska, and Wyoming without incident or drama. The kind of man who measured twice and wrote once and never, not once in 30 years of field work, lost sleep over what he found in the ground. His assistant and junior surveyor was the aforementioned Thomas Aldrich Webb, fresh out of the Montana School of Mines. The kind of young man whose eyes were still wide enough to absorb the world without flinching. The remaining 5 were laborers, hired hands from Missoula, hard-drinking and harder-working, men whose names would never appear in any official record. Men who would carry what they witnessed in that frozen field for the rest of their lives, without a single institution ever asking them what they had seen. They found it on day 4. The location, triangulated decades later by independent researchers using Webb's field notes and the original survey grid coordinates, places the discovery site approximately 11 miles northeast of present-day Hamilton, Montana, a broad, shallow depression in the terrain where the Earth had, at some point in the past, clearly been disturbed. not by geological forces, not by erosion or seismic activity. The soil composition, as Webb described it in his notes, was wrong. It was layered in a way that made no natural sense: compacted hard clay at the surface, then loose black soil beneath it, then a stratum of what he called glassy gravel, almost like melted stone. Uniform in color and size in a way that God's hand never makes uniform. And beneath that, 4 feet, 2 inches below the surface of the Montana earth, the object itself. Webb's notes describe the initial moment of discovery with a precision that is itself extraordinary, because most men in that situation would have used imprecise language. They would have said it was big or strange or frightening. Webb, trained as he was in the vocabulary of measurement and dimension, wrote with a surveyor's eye. He estimated the object's length at approximately 22 feet, its width at 9 feet. Its height, and here his handwriting shifts, becomes slightly irregular at roughly 4 feet at its highest point, sloping down at both ends in a curve that he compared with evident bewilderment to the cross-section of a teardrop. Not an oval, not a rectangle, a teardrop. In 1900, in Montana, the surface material defeated every attempt at description. Webb tried 4 different comparisons and crossed them all out. He settled ultimately on 2 words: continuously smooth. No visible joints, no rivets, no welds, no seams of any kind. The surface appeared to be a single continuous piece, which was, in 1900, an absolute manufacturing impossibility at that scale for any known material. The color, under the gray January sky, appeared to shift. Webb noted it as dark like graphite, but in certain angles of the winter light, showing deep blue-green in a way that seemed to come from inside the material rather than reflected from outside. The men touched it. It was cold, as everything was cold that day, but Webb noted with unease that it did not feel as cold as the surrounding earth, as though something within it retained heat, as though something within it had not entirely gone dormant. Gerald Croft, the foreman, did what experienced and rational men do when confronted with the incomprehensible. He attempted to normalize it. He hypothesized aloud, for the benefit of his spooked crew, that it was likely a piece of foreign military equipment, perhaps a French experimental vehicle, or a German prototype that had been shipped west and buried for reasons of industrial espionage. He said this with complete conviction. He said it because he needed to say something. Because the alternative, standing in silence in the Montana cold, staring at something that had no name in any language any of them spoke, was not a thing that a foreman of Gerald Croft's temperament could allow. You name the thing, you minimize it, you move on, but Croft could not name it. Nobody could, because the object, whatever it was, bore markings, not decoration, not manufacturer's stamps or government insignia in any recognizable form. Markings. Intricate, deliberate, precise markings etched, or perhaps embedded, into the surface in a pattern that Webb spent 2 full pages of his field journal attempting to reproduce by hand. The markings ran along what appeared to be the lower edge of the object's body, evenly spaced, each approximately 2 inches in height. Webb, who had studied technical drafting, described them as neither letters nor numbers in any alphabet known to me, but possessing the organized logic of both, as though designed to convey specific information to a reader who understood the system. The way our own numerals would mean nothing to a man who had only seen Chinese script. It would be another 70 years before anyone would use the phrase user interface in a technological context. But what Thomas Webb described in his frost-stiffened handwriting in January of 1900 sounds, with a precision that raises every hair on the back of your neck, exactly like a user interface panel. The men worked until dark trying to excavate the full perimeter of the object. They discovered, as they dug, that the underside of the vehicle, and there is no better word for it, because the object's proportions and the nature of its form suggest, unmistakably, a vehicle designed to move, was raised slightly off the base of its excavated bed, not resting on the earth directly, hovering above it by approximately 1.5 inches, in a gap that Webb measured 3 separate times because he could not believe the measurement was consistent. It was consistent. The object was not touching the ground. It was suspended above it. What suspended it, Webb could not determine. There was nothing visible between the object's undercarriage and the soil beneath. No mechanism, no support structure, nothing. One of the laborers, a man Webb identifies only as the pole Merck, reached his hand into that 1.5-inch gap. Webb records what happened next in language so careful and restrained that it reads almost like a medical report. Merck withdrew his hand almost immediately, with an expression of surprise rather than pain, and stated that he felt warmth, not heat, but steady warmth and a pressure, gentle but firm, as though something was pushing back against his palm. The Pole, Merck, never returned to survey work after January 1900. Nobody followed up with him. Nobody, in the official record, ever asked him what he felt. Gerald Croft filed his survey report on January 22, 1900. The report, which is a matter of public record in the Northern Pacific Railroad Company archives, makes no mention of the object. It describes the terrain as surveyed, the elevation measurements as recorded, the corridor as viable for rail development, and the team as returned without incident. Every measurement in the report is accurate. Every notation is professional and complete. The object is not mentioned, not once, not in a footnote, not in a margin, not in a separate addendum marked confidential, not anywhere. It is as though 7 men spent 4 days in the Montana wilderness and found nothing but frozen earth and cold sky. And yet Thomas Webb kept his notes. He kept them, as we know, sewn into the lining of his coat, a gray wool overcoat he purchased in Missoula in December of 1899 and wore, according to his granddaughter Margaret Webb Holloway, until the coat literally fell apart in the mid-1940s, at which point he transferred the hidden page to the lining of a new coat with the careful, practiced hands of a man who had been doing this for 40 years. Margaret Holloway described her grandfather as a quiet man, a man who did not speak about his work, a man who became, in her childhood memory, increasingly, her word was watchful, as though he was always waiting for something to arrive or someone to come. He never explained why. He never told her about the page. When she found it after his death, she read it in his study, in his chair with his reading glasses, the one she had kept because she couldn't bring herself to throw them away. She read it once, she told the independent researcher David Kessler in a 1987 interview, and then she set it down on his desk, and she sat for a very long time without moving. Because what she had read, what her grandfather had recorded in that field, in that frozen Montana January, at the dawn of the 20th century, did not belong to the 20th century. What the page described, in its final section, the section Webb had originally tried to tear away, the section Croft had presumably torn from his own journal, was this: that as the light failed on the 4th day and the temperature dropped, and the crew was preparing to cover the object and mark the coordinates and make camp, the object changed. Not dramatically, not with noise or explosion or spectacle. It changed quietly, the way a sleeping person shifts in the night, a small, almost imperceptible movement. Webb, who was the closest to it, was the only one who saw it clearly. One section of the object's surface, a panel, roughly 16 inches wide and 10 inches tall, on what appeared to be the forward portion of the body, became, for approximately 45 seconds, translucent. Not transparent, not glass, Translucent in the way that certain types of frosted quartz are translucent, enough to suggest depth without revealing it. And within that translucent section, Webb wrote there was illumination, not the orange flicker of fire, not the harsh white spark of an arc lamp, a soft, even blue-white glow, steady, controlled. The kind of light that does not waver because it has no reason to waver. The kind of light that comes from a source that is not burning, not consuming, not dying as it gives itself. The kind of light that in 1900 did not exist. Thomas Webb stared at it for 45 seconds. He memorized it. He wrote it down the moment he turned away, because he understood, with the precise and analytical mind that had been trained to measure and record the world, that he was looking at something that the world, his world, the world of January 1900, had no context for, no vocabulary for, no box to put it in. The glow faded. The surface returned to its dark, seamless graphite and blue-green continuity. The object was, once again, simply an object. The crew covered it at dawn. Boards and frozen soil and brush, enough to conceal it from casual observation, not enough to contain it. Webb marked the coordinates in his private notes, with a precision that would allow a competent surveyor to return to within 10 feet of the location. He marked them in a notation system of his own devising, not the standard grid reference, but a personal code. One that Margaret Holloway eventually worked out from context and cross-reference in the 1980s. She passed the coordinates to David Kessler. Kessler drove to Montana in the spring of 1988. He found the depression in the earth, exactly as Webb's notes described, 11 miles northeast of Hamilton. The terrain shifted and compacted in that unnatural way, the soil composition still. Nearly 90 years later, wrong in that specific and identifiable manner. He found nothing else. The object was gone, not eroded, not disintegrated, not grown over by time, gone, removed. The excavation site, when Kessler brought in a ground-penetrating radar unit 2 weeks later, showed evidence of a subsequent and very deliberate excavation, heavy equipment. Professional-grade soil disturbance, the kind of operation that requires significant resources and significant authority. The radar also showed something else, something Kessler noted in his own research journal, with the same careful understatement that Thomas Webb had used 88 years earlier. A faint but consistent electromagnetic anomaly at the original depth of the object's discovery. As though the ground itself remembered what had rested there. As though the Earth retained, in its own molecular memory, the signature of something that had no business being buried in it. Kessler filed a Freedom of Information Act request in 1989, targeting the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Defense, and the National Archives, seeking any records pertaining to an unscheduled excavation in Ravalli County, Montana, between 1900 and 1950. He received, after a 14-month wait, a response confirming that records pertaining to his request existed but were classified under a national security exemption. The exemption, the letter stated, was not scheduled to expire. Kessler filed a follow-up request in 1991. The follow-up response informed him that the classification seal on the relevant documents had been reviewed and extended to the year 2075. Think about that for a moment. Sit with it. The United States government has classified documents related to an excavation in rural Montana, documents that, if they concern what Thomas Webb described, would be over a century old, and has decided that the American public should not see those documents until 75 years from now. Until the year 2075. Until nearly everyone alive today is gone, until the question of what was found in that earth has had another full human lifetime to be forgotten. Why? What exactly does a government protect when it buries the record of something that was already buried? The theories exist, as they always do. They gather in the darker corners of the conversation like smoke looking for an exit. Time displacement, temporal artifact. An object that traveled not across geography but across time itself, forward or backward. Arriving in 1900, from a future so distant that its technology appears to us, the way a jet aircraft would appear to a medieval blacksmith. The design philosophy of the object, the teardrop aerodynamics, the seamless monocoque body, the electromagnetic suspension, the integrated illuminated interface, aligns, with unsettling precision, with speculative vehicle designs for the mid-21st century. Designs that exist today only in the theoretical papers of aerospace and automotive engineers, who are dreaming of a world decades away. Designs that were not dreamed of, were not even conceptually imaginable in 1900. And yet there it was, in Montana, in January, in the Earth. The air in that field must have carried something beyond cold, beyond the bite of a January that the thermometers recorded and the almanacs preserved. It must have carried the weight of a question that no instrument then existing could measure, a question about the nature of time itself, about whether the line we call history is as straight and one-directional as we have always assumed, or whether it bends, loops, folds back on itself in ways that occasionally deposit a piece of the future in the frozen ground of the past. Thomas Webb died not knowing the answer. David Kessler is still looking. And somewhere, in a classified archive that won't open for another 49 years, in a file folder sealed with the quiet authority of a government that decided, at some point between 1900 and today, that some discoveries are too large for the public to hold, the answer may already exist. Written down, measured precisely, waiting. The way all the most important things wait, in silence, in the dark, in the cold, suspended just above the ground, giving off a light that nobody born in its time was supposed to see. The machine came from somewhere, or somewhen, and until 2075 that is all we are permitted to know.